Good evening and welcome to The Right Side, the show where we talk about today's news, issues, and trends from an admittedly conservative perspective. This evening we're very lucky to have a guest that's a former member of the Obama administration. He was there for a couple of years as the Assistant Deputy Secretary of Commerce. His name is Ro Khanna. He's also a recent congressional candidate, and he's the author of Entrepreneurial Nation, which talks about how to bring manufacturing jobs back to America. And that's going to be the majority of our topic of conversation for this evening, but we're going to get to know a little bit about Ro as well. So, Ro, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me on, Chris.
So, talk to me a little bit about how you got yourself into a cushy gig within the Obama administration. How did that work?
I don't know, cushy, there were long 80-hour weeks in any administration, but I got to be the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce. I had actually worked on the president's very first campaign, coincidentally, when I was an undergraduate at University of Chicago, and he was running for the state Senate. I think that helped, and then I'd done a lot of work with the Democratic Party on innovation issues, on intellectual property and trade. I found myself overseeing 109 of our commerce offices that have the mission to increase exports and increase American manufacturing. And it was a fascinating job where I got to travel around the country and meet successful manufacturers and help them find markets overseas and figure out how to make things in the United States.
Which is great, and it's exciting and everything else. You actually took the time to capture a number of those stories in your book. Did you know when you were touring that you'd be writing the book, or how did this kind of come along?
No, it's sort of, I kept meeting these inspiring stories of American manufacturers, and before the job, frankly, I had thought most manufacturing had gone offshore, and I would meet companies that were making fire suits here and blenders and airplanes, and I said, wow, I didn't know this. Probably a lot of people don't know it, and then I started paying more attention. And probably halfway between the job, I said, wow, there are a lot of interesting stories. Let me start really writing something about this. So it was more organic, as I was surprised that America is still neck and neck with China when it comes to manufacturing.
Which is interesting, because I know that a lot of people have no idea whatsoever that we still do. We are one of the world leaders in manufacturing, although politically we talk about all the jobs that are being offshored and everything else. You did make some references within the book to the difficulty, some of the political climate, some of the trade imbalances that might be noticed by some of these manufacturers as they're trying to compete in their own marketplaces. Tell us a little bit about that and what you saw.
Well, I think the frustration a lot of manufacturers have is that the trading field, it's not a level playing field. You have in China the regime manipulating its currency, providing subsidies for manufacturers, free land, free rent, not enforcing intellectual property laws, requiring joint venture agreements as a condition to selling into the market. And, you know, this is not a free market, and it's hurting, frankly, China's own consumers, because it's not at the expense of China's exporters, and it's hurting American manufacturers. And so certainly pushing for reform is critical to increase our manufacturing base.
So the curiosity I would have is why you focused on manufacturers specifically, because I was, quote unquote, a host of a Chinese trade delegation many years ago. And I had an opportunity to see what you're talking about, where they come in and they do the pitch. They show you, and this was not for necessarily as much manufacturing, but more for IT types of code development types of services, where they have cities that are wired to the internet and everything else, a highly trained workforce. They offer no tax, no income tax for a certain amount of time, no corporate tax for a certain amount of time, and they will fly the workers here, et cetera. And they make a very compelling case about making it an easy place for you to do business versus some of the other things that are happening here in the United States, which make it increasingly difficult to do business. But why manufacturing versus just looking globally at how to create jobs in this current economy?
Well, that's a great question, and certainly manufacturing isn't the only answer. I mean, the service sector is going to grow more when it comes to job creation. That said, it would be malpractice for our country to lose its manufacturing base for three reasons. One, 70% of world trade is still manufactured goods. So we have a $6 billion trade surplus with China when it comes to service goods. We have a $220 billion trade deficit when it comes to manufacturing goods. You simply can't balance the trade deficit selling more legal services and Hollywood movies. We need a manufacturing base. Mm-hmm. Secondly, the link between manufacturing and innovation. Almost 90% of patents come from manufacturing firms. If you lose production, we see that design follows. When we lost a lot of semiconductor manufacturing, solar design went offshore. And so it's critical for an innovation perspective to retain at least advanced manufacturing in the United States. Right. And finally, the third point is this still provides 10 to 12 million jobs that pay well, that sustain the middle class. So I think on a bipartisan basis, we ought to care about being a manufacturing leader.
I'm not in disagreement. I just saw, as I was reading your book, some of the things that would make people feel good to know existed within the manufacturing companies that you interviewed, people who are proud of their products, right, who are constantly looking at ways to innovate and be competitive, even with all of the monstrous things happening in other countries that would theoretically put us at a disadvantage.
Exactly.
That they still took pride of ownership, they still got in there, and they figured out how they were going to innovate, how they were going to make things better. And I could sense your excitement about these things
right
when I was reading the book, but then I was thinking, you know, I take for granted, having worked inside companies, that this is just how Americans think. This is just how they operate. They
right.
take pride, or they get fired.
Right.
But the people who really care about what they're doing, they show up excited to work and to contribute, and they look at a request from a client not as necessarily an annoyance, but a challenge that they
right. can
overcome. And in doing so, create new business models. And,
right.
For example, a more silent blender
right.
was something that you had mentioned.
Right.
And so that was the thing that I thought it was too limited to just talk about manufacturing, when it's more the American ethos and the entrepreneurial spirit that I see all around us.
Well, I appreciate that, and certainly the book was trying to convey that about the entrepreneurial spirit, the American work ethic, the hard work. But for me, my expertise was through manufacturing. And I'm not in any way a great writer, but, you know, great writers say that they write about a locality sure. to touch on universal themes.
Right.
So they may write about the South, but that's really talking about the human condition.
Right.
And for me, my sense was, can I get to that American essence, that American spirit, mm-hmm. by focusing on manufacture. Right. So to the extent that that's what comes through, and I think at the conclusion I say that these manufacturers are really a symbol for American resilience, American promise, and not giving up on this country.
Mm-hmm. So I would get really excited at points, and then there was the conservative that kicked in with me, and you. What would happen is there were a number of things that I saw that. For example, it seemed that you were bumping your head against some bureaucracy even within your own department or
yeah.
your own organization. Talk to me a little bit about that, because that's the part that would make me bald in almost no time flat, just ripping my hair out.
Well, the one thing that I learned is you have to get 9 or 10 concurrences to do anything. I mean, so it's a slow-moving bureaucracy. And one of the things we accomplished is we brought performance metrics in allocating resources. So we have these 109 offices. It used to be wherever a congressperson or senator wanted someone, you send someone there. And my boss, it wasn't my idea, said, this is ridiculous. I've been in the private sector. We ought to look at the rate of return, how much exports is someone generating per office, and we did that. So
I feel better now. Thank you for sharing that part.
Well, it wasn't my idea, it was my boss's idea, but we got to implement it. And what I told, I was just coming from teaching a class, and I was telling the students, I said, in Washington, it's tough to make huge changes, but you can do tangible things and do them well. And so I felt like we did some things to make the bureaucracy a little more efficient.
Okay, good. Do you think they'll stick?
I think that one will stick. Good. And I do think that there's a becoming an awareness, even in Washington, about having more metrics. I mean, one of the stories I told here is Andy Grove, when he asked me, he said, well, figure out I've got a homework assignment as a condition of meeting you. And I said, well, how hard can this be? I've got every economist at my disposal at Commerce. And he said, well, find out how many jobs are we outsourcing every month and how many jobs are we insourcing. Turns out we don't measure that as a United States government. And so Grove's point was, well, if you don't measure something, how are you going to achieve it? And I think as this we get more people with some private sector experience in government, they're going to realize that a metrics-based approach, a performance-based approach is good. And it's good if you have a liberal vision of government, because you want to show that government works to be able to fund government. So
sure.
I think there should be a consensus that we want the type of government that's going to produce results.
I'm in a complete agreement on that. So one of the things that I would get excited about, and then you'd bring me back a little bit and just kind of that, is that you would talk about they were overcoming all of these adversities, and then you were saying, and this is why we need to fund them with government funds or whatever. Talk to me about that and why if they're doing well, why we would need to fund them.
It's a great point. I mean, I am not for government direct funding to the private companies, but the question is, can there be certain government programs that are helping manufacturers be more competitive? And every other country has that. And you know what? They copied us, because it was, as I put in the book, it was Alexander Hamilton and Lincoln and influenced all the way to Herbert Hoover who came up with this American economic system, which said government has a role to assist private industry in being competitive. And so let's be very practical about some of the government programs I recommend. One was what I was doing, the United States Foreign Commercial Service. Here you had individuals from the government who said, we will help you if you're a manufacturer, go overseas to sell into India or China. Now, this is something, if you're GE or Boeing, you don't need the government's help.
There are consultants that do it as well.
There are consultants to do it. But if you're a small and medium-sized manufacturer and you have 20 employees and you haven't really thought about going overseas, it helps that you can work with one of our embassies there. They can find potential buyers and give you a start in going and selling overseas. Sure. And this is not an indefinite subsidy or a handout. This is just providing a little bit of assistance in helping a manufacturer compete. Similarly with the Manufacturing Extension Partnership. That was actually a Reagan initiative. It was a bipartisan bill in the 80s that Reagan passed, and it says we have individuals who are going to help your company become more efficient, adopt the efforts with Select America or others that are starting haven't been fully implemented to try to see if you can have a one-stop shop for getting a lot of these permitting and regulations dealt with.
Well, to be clear, I mean, conservatives don't say that there should be no regulation.
Of course.
I mean, the EPA, I think, has its place. I'm not one of them that says take the whole thing out.
Right.
We don't want to chew our air or see our air
right.
and chew our water or that kind of thing.
Right.
But at the same time, it's not just sophisticated manufacturing companies that have challenges with the permitting process.
Right.
Because we have boards or pseudo boards, NGOs that show up and they say that they want to piece the permitting action and everything else. And you've even got Carl's Jr. who manufactures hamburgers.
Right.
And they're saying that they can't put any more restaurants in California because it takes 6 months to 2 years.
Right.
Versus 6 weeks and they're up in Texas from the time they identify a spot. Mm-hmm. So there does have to be a balance, and there has to be a way of streamlining the process. But when we look at things such as having to buy carbon credits on the auction cycle, that's a direct cost that's going to be passed on to, well, if it's the refineries and the fuel production and everything else, that's going to be passed on to everybody who uses energy of any sort, which means that the cost of the manufactured goods go up, which means that the cost at the counter goes up. And so that makes us, I think, I'm not saying that we should have no regulation, but things like cap and trade could put California manufacturers specifically at an extreme disadvantage in my mind. How do they navigate that? How do they make it easier here?
Well, it could be an advantage too if you're forced to produce with energy efficiency as the standard, and it's inspiring, innovative, and productive behavior. So, you know, I mean, some of the European manufacturers, when they had strict environmental regulations, actually produced more efficient cars and other things, and it actually inspired better products. That said, also, you know, we have an abundance of natural gas in this country, which I think is a promising source of cheaper energy. And I think, I mean, even though we discussed China earlier and the problems with the Chinese trading regime, and we can blame regulations, I think the fundamental issue is, how do we get to the higher end of the value curve in producing things? How do we have an innovative workforce that is continually inventing new products, being creative? That's how we're going to outcompete other states and other countries. And to me, that's the real crux of the problem. Do we have to tinker and make sure we streamline regulations? Absolutely. Do we have to make things easier? Yes. But we can compete while being environmentally sound if we are at the higher end of manufacturing.
But I think it's just part of the again, going back to the American psyche and wanting to do things in a cleaner, more efficient way. When you start to get into the first world types of countries, they tend to be more efficient in their environmental pursuits and everything else anyway. It's just people who've achieved a certain level want to live in a clean environment.
Exactly.
I mean, they don't want to live in a business ghetto of some sort.
The other point to that is, I think, in attracting the next generation, I mean, one of the things that struck me as I reread the book a while back is, you know, most of the people I talk to are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and there are not that many young people with the same values that you're talking about. And how are we going to attract them into manufacturing? I think things like being environmentally sound, caring about global warming and the effects of that, is going to attract a lot of the kids at Stanford and Berkeley to go into manufacturing because they're motivated by wanting to change the world.
One of the things so for example, my brother's a teacher at an ROP program, and we can talk about that later. But so one of the things that I think we need to look at is, if we are putting money into public education, as an example, that not all kids are going to go to Stanford.
Right. Absolutely.
And so we need to get them the skills, basic skills that they would need for manufacturing type jobs or blue collar types of jobs, and we can do that at a high school level or at a level maybe just beyond that, that's not necessarily a 4-year university or that kind of thing, trade type schools.
Right.
And so that, I think, would be another thing that would make it attractive for employers to have a base of candidates that can do the kind of work that's being requested of them. And so that's another place where I think we might agree that some government involvement may be okay, may be warranted, but we have to have the workforce that can do the work as well as a clean place to do it.
Absolutely, and I think it would be good if I had more metalworking or shop classes. I mean, we've grown up with a generation of people who don't know and appreciate the value of these skills, and if it would be practically good to have them for people who can then go get jobs in those areas, and also for people who, like me, go and do other things to say, well, you know, that's hard. You know, I mean, have you ever tried to operate a CNC machine? You know, that's just as hard as copying, pasting, and doing a brief. And so to increase the respect for some of these professions. Yeah,
I mean, I can drive a forklift as an example.
Right.
So, you know, I mean, these are things that are valuable later. Just having that mechanical aptitude, even like you said, if we don't do anything with it career-wise, probably pick up an extra talent or at least an understanding of another person's shoes. It's valuable. So, we'll end it on a happy note. We've got about a minute and a half left.
Great.
Tell me where you identified the biggest opportunity for manufacturing in your travels.
And a general thing, anything that is advanced manufacturing that's requiring precision, that's requiring innovation, specifically in industries, aerospace is one where we do very well. Steel, surprisingly, we're doing quite well. Of course, clean technology manufacturing in certain areas of energy efficiency in particular, the United States is doing well. Medical equipment is a place where we're doing well. But I think that the bottom line is almost any product, if we are bringing a approach that's going to increase efficiency and going to invent the next generation of product, we can compete. And that's exciting because it means that America is not only going to lead economically, but we're actually going to be contributing to the technological progress of the world.
Great. So if people want to get a hold of you, want to learn more about your book, your background, the things that you're working on coming up in the political arena, et cetera, is there a website they can go to?
There is. It's www.rokhanna.com.
And spell that for people.
Of course. It's ROKHANNA.com.
Great. Well, Ro, thanks for coming and sharing this evening. I've been looking forward to a similar conversation as this for some time.
I have too, and I appreciate it. I think coming across the aisle and with especially on manufacturing is so critical because I can't see anyone in America not wanting to grow our manufacturing base.
All right, agreed.
Thanks,
Ro.
Thank you.
Hang tight. At this moment, we're going to have a word from our underwriter, the Conservative Forum.
Constitutional law attorney. And they say, well, really, what kind of constitutional law attorney? I said, well, I'm the true kind, the kind that believe that the Constitution is what the Constitution says and what it was intended to say. Anything beyond that is tyranny and should not be allowed.
So let's come to this, my friends. You ready? The second American Revolution against a ruling class that simply lectures but does not listen or defend the American people. It is government versus the people. Am I right? Yeah. Look at the Electoral College example. Right? A leftist popular challenge to states' rights. You think the founders weren't brilliant people? Did they not know what they were doing by carefully calibrating to get the small states and the big states to come together? Why does Wyoming get 2 senators in California? Actually, I'd rather have Wyoming's 2 senators.
And that was a word from our underwriter, the Conservative Forum. The Conservative Forum meets typically the first Tuesday of each month at the IFES Portuguese Hall at 432 Steerlin Road here in Mountain View. And they're known for their speakers, in addition to underwriting our program and many of the other initiatives that they do. And just so you know, the upcoming speakers, for example, in December, we have our Christmas party, and Armstrong and Getty will be the speakers at that event. In January, it's Jeroen Broek he's the director of the Ayn Rand Institute. In February, Kevin Jackson from the Black Sphere. In March, a panel discussion on how to fix education, and yes, unions have been invited to participate as well. In April, Hillsdale College's Dr. David Bobb, and in May, what I'm looking forward to, Bill Whittle will be the speaker. And so we'd like to thank them again for making the show possible, and you can learn more about them at theconservativeforum.com. In closing, I'm glad to have been able to have this discussion with Ro Khanna this evening. Again, he's the author of The Entrepreneurial Nation, and the discussion was good, and I think it's one that needs to happen on a bipartisan level with people across the ideological spectrum. We need to work together to create jobs within not only California, but the country as a whole, and the only way we're going to get through this economy is banding together and taking the best possible approaches from everyone's perspective and combining them into something that's workable, acknowledging the need for balanced and streamlined regulation, as well as a cost-effective environment and a strong workforce to bring the different types of jobs, manufacturing, software development, and otherwise, to market. So get out there, get active, make sure that you're involved in what's happening locally, and if you can put your input into the local, regional, and state and federal discussion, please do so. Thanks again for joining us this evening on The Right Side. I'm your host, Chris Pareja, and I look forward to seeing you in person or sometime soon on the show. Thanks. Have a great night.